Welcome to my channel, welcome to a new video. Today we are going to be working on the chassis. If you have been following my build, then you know that we finalized most of the packaging and therefore we can now also go into detail engineering of the chassis. In this episode what I will be doing is starting basically the lower section of the chassis and getting all the hard points in for sections of the chassis, and I'm focusing on getting sheet metal to fit very nicely so that it can be welded correctly. And yeah, after the entire chassis is done, then we go on to weight saving, and but that's not in this episode. Today we will just focus on getting the basic of the chassis layout done. During the packaging design, I mentioned that I wanted to change the chassis style a little bit from the FEM model that I made. Reason for that was that I wanted to have a removable nose cone, basically where the suspension and steering is mounted on, so that if you have an impact on your front wheel, for example, it might be that the suspension is damaged, and it might also be that the hard points for the suspension are damaged, and those are internally welded into the construction to generate longer wishbones, and therefore I wanted to have the nose cone repairable, and therefore we have a mounting flange in the nose cone and on the main chassis. And so we start off with making the base plate, 5mm thick base plate, where we can mount the nose cone section on, and that 5mm base plate is the center point for the main chassis and mounting point to the nose cone. When we have that finished, then we can start with the outer sheet metal plate that basically makes the shape of the chassis shell itself. The chassis shell itself will be made out of a 1mm thick sheet metal, high strength steel, either Strengths or Domex or something like that, and because of the shape it will generate a lot of stiffness, and by adding proper stiffness inside that, that bended profile that we are making, it should generate a very rigid chassis. For the rest, we're gonna try and make as much box sections as possible. For the flooring, we will generate a rail that goes from the thickened plate at the front all the way to the back. That strip is basically there to help guide all the energy from the front impact through the chassis to the back of the chassis and out towards the back, basically around the battery pack. And so that's basically how we envision that part. So it starts at the front as a raised floor and then continues all the way underneath the driver's seat over the battery pack, and basically in the main structure for the side impact protection.
life. And yet the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. We dare not forget today that we are the heirs of that first revolution. Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit more undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed, and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to ensure the survival and the success of liberty. This much we pledge and more. Those old allies whose cultural
Something I saw during the design is that I have these very thick side impact bars around the shoulders and at the basically at the hips, and currently there's a lot of different structures there, and what I saw is that I can basically make one big box section on the side, from basically the rear of the chassis to where the knees are. Box sections are basically the best way to stiffen up a chassis and to make it rigid. So making these big box sections in the sides basically make the chassis very stiff and very rigid against bending. And also with the big box sections underneath the knees, basically the anti-submarine unit, that also generates a lot of stiffness. So together with all the additional stiffness that we have, we generated a very stiff structure, and we removed a lot of separate pieces. So in the old chassis design, I made stiffening rails at the bottom and at the top of the chassis, and they are now completely removed by other structures that incorporate a much larger surface and generate much more stiffness. And that also means that we have way less parts, and therefore also less costs.
To our sister republic, south of our border, we offer a special pledge to convert our good words into good deeds, in a new alliance for progress, to assist free men and free government in casting off the chains of poverty. But this peaceful revolution of hope cannot become the prey of hostile powers. Let all our neighbors know that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. And let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house. To that World Assembly of Sovereign States, the United Nations, our last best hope, in the name age where the instruments of war have far outpaced the instruments of peace, we renew our pledge of support to prevent it from becoming merely a forum for invective, to strengthen its shield of the new and the weak, and to enlarge the area in which its grit may run. Finally, to those nations who would make themselves our adversary, we offer not a pledge, but a request that both sides begin anew the quest for peace. Before the dark powers of destruction, unleashed by science, engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction. We dare not tempt them with weakness, for only when our arms are sufficient beyond doubt can we be certain beyond doubt that they will never be employed. But neither can two great and powerful groups of nations take comfort from our present course, both sides overburdened by the cost of modern weapons, both rightly alarmed by the steady spread of the deadly atom, yet both racing to alter that uncertain balance of terror that stays the hand of mankind's final war. So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness, and sincerity is always subject to proof. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. Let both sides explore what problems unite us, instead of belaboring those problems which divide us. Let both sides, for the first time, formulate serious and precise proposals for the inspection and control of arms, and bring absolute power work effort. In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of presenting the power of their I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would trade in with any other people or any other generation the energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor whereby our country and all who serve it and the souls of that fire and truly like the world. And so, my fellow Americans,
Now the back box that I'm making here is basically it's integrating part of the seat, and it's basically also the firewall to protect the batteries. So that piece has to be completely welded. As you can see from some of the views that I'm showing, there are very nice welding gaps. So most of the chassis could be welded with a TIG. Since I only have MIG, it will most likely be welded with MIG. A point that I always found a little bit difficult is how to make the top of the chassis with the basically the dashboard frame. First of all, it needs to be a very strong and rigid part of the chassis so that forces of the side impact can be transferred over from the left side to the right side, for example. And now when I was working on the model, it also became obvious that the knees need a little bit of room. So very simplistic bulge is basically now made, and with that simplistic bulge we have some space to make space for the knees, but also make a space for a dashboard cluster. And a secondary piece of the dashboard cluster is angled and mounted in between the top of the chassis and basically the dashboard, generating a stiff profile underneath the dashboard going from the left side to the right side. And basically from the gauge cluster I need to go around the hands and the steering wheel to the sides to help get the forces at us from a side impact, basically to go through the dashboard, through the gauge cluster, over to the opposite side. And yeah, that's by developing this section, it allowed me to accidentally on purpose design this. Furthermore, I added the steering column, and as you can see I made a slotted hole for the steering column. That means that we can raise and lower the steering wheel somewhat. Currently I have the steering wheel position at the highest point, maybe it needs to go a little bit lower, and I need to have sufficient space for snap-off steering wheel. What that means is that the steering wheel itself will be removable. As you can see from the small space within the vehicle, we need a structure like that, otherwise we are not able to get into the vehicle or get out of it. So the steering wheel needs to be removable. So I hope that you like this video. As you can see, this video we started basically detailing most of the lower section of the chassis. In the next episode we will continue on with that and also start integrating more and more interior pieces, and hopefully by the end of that episode we will then have a good representation of what the chassis needs to look like. I hope that we can also do some weight saving in that episode and see if we can hit the 60 kilograms mark for the entire nose cone and main chassis part with the roll hoop included. Yeah, so I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope you continue watching if you want to give it a thumbs up, and thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Thank you, bye bye.